Why did we stop using copper to stop garden fungus? Old farmers twisted copper wire around fruit tree trunks. Vineyard owners in France discovered it by accident in the 1880s. Copper ions disrupt the enzymes inside fungal cells on contact. The chemical fungicide industry replaced it within 1 generation. Why? 2 things explain why almost nobody reaches for copper when fungus shows up on their tomatoes, their roses, or their fruit trees. One involves the actual chemistry of how copper kills fungal cells, which most gardeners have never been taught, and which most modern gardening guides skip entirely in favor of simply listing a product name and an application rate. The other involves who profits every time you buy a $30 bottle of synthetic fungicide. Instead of a small bag of copper sulfate that costs a fraction of the price and lasts for years in storage without losing its effectiveness, by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how copper kills fungus at the cellular level, the accidental French discovery that built the foundation of organic fungicide use for the next century and a half, and why a mineral compound still legal for certified organic farms today has quietly become invisible to most home gardeners, who reach for a synthetic spray instead, without ever learning that the older, cheaper option exists and works just as well. The story does not begin with a laboratory. It begins with theft. In the Bordeaux region of France in the early 1880s, vineyard owners had a persistent problem with passers-by stripping grapes from the rows closest to the road. The solution one estate manager landed on was simple and slightly mischievous. He dusted the roadside vines with a visible, unappetizing mixture of copper, sulfate, and lime. A combination, ugly enough and bitter enough to discourage anyone tempted to pick the fruit. The mixture coated the leaves a distinctive blue-green color, immediately recognizable, impossible to mistake for an untreated vine, and unpleasant enough in appearance and taste that even a hungry traveler would think twice before reaching for a cluster. This was a purely defensive, almost theatrical solution to a property problem, not an agricultural treatment of any kind. Nobody involved was thinking about fungal disease, soil chemistry, or plant pathology. They were thinking about grape thieves walking the road that ran alongside the estate during the harvest season, when ripe fruit hanging within easy reach of the roadside was simply too tempting for passers-by to ignore. Regardless of how many warnings the estate had posted, or how many times the workers had chased people off the property in previous years, what happened next was not what anyone expected. That same year, downy mildew, a fungal disease imported accidentally from American rootstock years earlier. During efforts to combat the Phylloxera louse devastating European vineyards, was tearing through French vineyards with devastating speed, destroying entire harvests across the wine-growing regions of the country. Vineyard after vineyard watched their crop collapse under the disease in a matter of weeks. But the roadside vines, the ones dusted with copper, sulfate, and lime to deter thieves, stayed healthy, while the vines around them, untreated, browned and withered. A botanist named Pierre Marilexis Millet, working at the University of Bordeaux, and already deeply involved in the broader fight against the vineyard diseases threatening French viticulture. During one of the most devastating agricultural crises in the country's history, noticed the pattern during a routine survey of affected vineyards, and investigated further. What he found became one of the foundational discoveries of plant pathology as a scientific discipline. The copper and lime mixture, refined and standardized through his subsequent research, became known as Bordeaux mixture, and it remains, over a century and 40 years later, one of the most widely used organic fungicides in the world. The accident of trying to stop grape theft became the solution to a disease that was on track to devastate the entire French wine industry, and by extension, the global wine trade that depended on French production. Stay with me, because the chemistry behind why copper works is the part that most modern gardening guides skip entirely. Fungal cells, like all living cells, depend on a precise set of enzymes to carry out the metabolic processes that keep them alive. Enzymes are proteins folded into specific three-dimensional shapes, and that shape is everything. An enzyme works because its shape allows it to bind to a specific molecule and catalyze a specific reaction. The way a key works only because its precise cut matches the specific tumblers inside a particular lock. Change the shape even slightly, and the enzyme stops functioning. The same way a slightly bent key stops opening the lock, it was cut for copper ions. Are extraordinarily good at disrupting protein shape. When copper ions contact a fungal cell, They bind to the sulfur-containing amino acids within the cell's enzymes and structural proteins, distorting their three-dimensional shape and rendering them non-functional. Sulfur-containing amino acids, like cysteine, have a particular chemical affinity for metal ions, and copper exploits that affinity aggressively, attaching itself to these sulfur sites and physically twisting the protein structure out of its functional shape. This is not a slow poisoning process. It is closer to switching off a machine by bending its internal gears out of alignment. Enzymes responsible for energy production, for cell wall synthesis, for nutrient transport, all become unable to perform their function the moment copper ions bind to the wrong part of their structure. This is why copper fungicide acts as a protectant rather than a systemic treatment that moves through plant tissue. It sits on the leaf surface, and when fungal spores land and attempt to germinate, the copper ions in that thin coating disrupt the spore's cellular machinery before infection can establish. The fungus does not get a chance to penetrate the plant tissue and begin its life cycle, because the enzymes it needs to germinate and grow stop functioning the moment they contact copper. This same mechanism is why copper has been valued as an antimicrobial material across human history in contexts that have nothing to do with farming. Ancient Egyptian medical texts dating back over 4,000 years reference copper for wound treatment and water purification. Long before anyone understood the underlying chemistry of why it worked, hospitals today are increasingly installing copper alloy surfaces on height touch points like door handles and bed rails, because copper kills bacteria and viruses on contact through the same fundamental mechanism, disrupting the proteins that microorganisms depend on to survive, with studies finding copper surfaces reduce microbial load far more effectively than stainless steel over the same time period. The chemistry that stopped downy mildew in a French vineyard in 1885 is the same chemistry that makes copper doorknobs measurably safer than stainless steel ones in a hospital corridor, and the same chemistry that made copper vessels a preferred material for water storage in cultures around the world for thousands of years before anyone had a microscope to see why. Here is where modern gardening practice and the chemical fungicide industry diverge from what farmers understood for most of the last century and a half. After milledet's discovery became widely known, copper-based fungicides became a standard part of agricultural practice across Europe and eventually North America. Farmers mixed their own Bordeaux mixture from copper, sulfate, and hydrated lime, a formula simple enough to prepare with materials available at any general store, requiring no specialized equipment beyond a bucket and a willingness to measure carefully. Old fruit growers in parts of the country developed a related practice of wrapping a length of copper wire around the lower trunk of fruit trees, allowing rainwater to wash trace amounts of copper down the bark and into the surrounding soil, providing a slow, continuous, low-level protective effect against certain fungal and bacterial pathogens that attack through the trunk and root collar. This wire wrapping technique was passed down as common orchard knowledge, the kind of practical wisdom an experienced grower simply knew without needing a horticultural degree to explain the underlying enzyme chemistry behind it. The arrival of synthetic systemic fungicides in the mid-20th century changed the commercial landscape entirely. These newer chemical compounds offered manufacturers something copper never could: patent protection, a formula that could be owned, branded, and sold at a controlled price point. With no competition from a mineral compound anyone could mix in their own kitchen from 2 cheap ingredients available at any hardware store, systemic fungicides also offered genuine technical advantages in certain applications. Moving through plant tissue rather than sitting only on the surface, providing protection that survives a rain event in a way that surface-applied copper does not, and offering modes of action that target specific fungal processes with precision that older, broader-acting treatments cannot match. But the technical advantages of synthetic fungicides do not fully explain why copper disappeared from the home gardener's toolkit so completely. A significant part of the explanation is simpler than chemistry. Synthetic fungicide companies built marketing relationships with garden centers, funded extension program literature and educational materials, sponsored demonstration plots at agricultural fairs, and shaped which products sat at eye level on store shelves. Through standard retail placement agreements that any branded consumer product relies on, copper sulfate, sold in plain bags by agricultural suppliers with no marketing budget attached, no consumer-facing branding, and no sales representative calling on garden center buyers, simply stopped appearing in the conversation that most home gardeners were having about how to treat a fungal problem. Your grandfather likely knew about Bordeaux mixture without ever needing the term explained to him, the way he knew which weeks to expect frost or which weeds signaled poor drainage. Commercial orchard operations have never stopped using copper-based treatments because they remain one of the few fungicides approved for certified organic production under USDA organic standards, precisely because the active ingredient is a naturally occurring mineral compound, rather than a synthesized chemical compound created in a laboratory. The knowledge did not disappear from agriculture. It disappeared from the conversation most backyard gardeners are exposed to, replaced by whatever synthetic product happens to occupy the shelf space at the local garden center this particular season. Here is exactly how to use copper correctly and the honest limitations that responsible use requires you to understand. Copper fungicide is available commercially in several forms. Copper sulfate, the traditional Bordeaux mixture component, requires you to combine it with hydrated lime in the correct ratio to neutralize its acidity and prevent leaf damage, a process that demands accurate measurement, but uses two ingredients that have been agricultural staples for well over a century. Premixed copper soap, technically copper octanote, is a gentler, ready-to-use formulation widely available at garden centers, and easier for beginners to apply correctly without measuring and mixing raw chemicals, making it the most accessible entry point for a home gardener trying copper for the first time. Fixed copper products, including copper hydroxide and copper oxychloride, offer another stable, slow-release option favored by many organic orchard operations, precisely because they release copper ions more gradually than soluble copper sulfate, reducing the risk of leaf burn while maintaining effective protection. Application timing matters more than almost any other variable in determining whether copper actually works. Copper functions as a protectant, meaning it needs to be on the plant surface before fungal spores arrive and attempt to germinate, not after an infection has already established itself in the plant tissue. Once a fungal pathogen has penetrated leaf tissue and begun growing inside the plant, surface-applied copper can no longer reach it. The most effective use of copper fungicide is therefore preventative. Applied at the first signs of conditions favorable to fungal disease, typically periods of high humidity, extended leaf wetness following rain, or the specific seasonal windows when a particular fungal pathogen is known to become active in your region based on past experience or local extension guidance. Apply before you see disease symptoms, not after the lesions have already appeared on your leaves. For fruit trees, the traditional dormant spray application, applied while the tree has no leaves in late winter or very early spring, allows copper to coat bark and bud surfaces before the growing season begins, providing protection during the vulnerable period when buds are breaking and tender new growth is most susceptible to infection from overwintering fungal spores already present on the bark surface. For vegetable garden use, copper soap applied to tomatoes, peppers, and cucurbits at the first sign of humid weather, before any visible lesions appear, follows the same protectant logic that Millet stumbled into in 1885. Reapplication after heavy rain is necessary because copper, sitting on the leaf surface rather than absorbed into plant tissue, washes off with sustained precipitation, the same way any surface coating would. The honest limitation that responsible guides must include concerns soil accumulation. Copper does not break down or wash away the way many organic treatments do. Repeated, heavy applications over many years can build up copper concentration in soil to levels that begin to harm beneficial soil microorganisms and, eventually, plant roots themselves. This is a real and well-documented concern in regions with long histories of intensive vineyard or orchard copper use, where soil testing across parts of Europe has found copper accumulation significant enough to require ongoing management attention, and, in some cases, regulatory limits on application rates. For the home gardener, applying copper occasionally as a targeted protectant during specific disease risk periods rather than as a routine, season-long spray schedule. This accumulation risk is minimal and unlikely to become a practical concern within a typical home garden's lifetime of use. But it is real, and any honest account of copper fungicide has to acknowledge it. Rather than presenting copper as a consequence-free alternative to synthetic chemistry that can be applied without any thought to cumulative effect, copper is also not selective, like salt, like many older agricultural treatments developed before the concept of selective biological action existed. It does not distinguish between harmful and beneficial microorganisms on contact. Overuse can suppress some of the same beneficial fungal and bacterial populations in soil that support healthy plant growth in the first place. The mycorrhizal networks and decomposer organisms that copper does not differentiate from the pathogens you are actually trying to control. The correct use case is targeted, preventative application during genuine disease pressure, not a default response to every garden problem, regardless of whether fungal disease is actually present or likely. Used this way with attention to timing and moderation. Copper remains exactly as effective today as it was in 1885. The enzymes inside a fungal spore have not evolved resistance to having their protein structure physically disrupted by copper ions, because that kind of resistance would require redesigning the fundamental chemistry of how proteins fold, not adapting to a single targeted toxin the way pathogens eventually adapt to many synthetic single-target fungicides over repeated exposure. This is part of why copper remains relevant in modern resistance management programs, used in rotation with synthetic fungicides, specifically because fungal populations that develop resistance to a synthetic single-site fungicide have not developed resistance to copper's broader, more fundamental mechanism of action, and likely never will in any meaningful time frame. The accident in a French vineyard in 1885 produced a fungicide that still works exactly as it did the day of Millet first investigated why the roadside vines stayed healthy. The chemical industry built an entire commercial category around alternatives that needed regular repurposing, branded formulas, and marketing budgets that a bag of copper sulfate never required and never could require, because no company can patent a mineral that has been sitting in the earth since before recorded history. Your tomatoes do not care which one has a more sophisticated advertising campaign or which one occupies more shelf space at the garden center this season. They care whether the fungal spore that landed on their leaf this morning encounters a surface that disrupts its enzymes before it can establish an infection. And on that question, the chemistry has not changed at all in over a century and 40 years. Copper sulfate costs a few dollars for enough material to treat a home garden for an entire season, and the bag, properly stored in a dry place, will last for years before you need to buy more. It has been doing this exact job through this exact mechanism since before your great-grandparents were born. Through wars, through the rise and fall of entire agricultural industries, through every shift in farming fashion that the 20th century produced, the synthetic fungicide industry arrived in the middle of the 20th century with patent protection, branded packaging, and a marketing budget large enough to make sure their products occupied the eye-level shelf space at every garden center in the country. Copper sulfate occupied no such budget and needed none, because the chemistry did the work that no advertisement ever could. Why did we stop reaching for the mineral that started it all? The one a vineyard manager discovered by accident while trying to stop grape thieves, the one that is still legal, still effective, and still sitting quietly in agricultural supply stores, while most home gardeners walk past it toward the branded bottle instead. If you found this genuinely useful, watch the next video and do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next one.